Right. Okay, comrades. First of all, welcome everybody to the meeting. On a day where we are getting a bit of sunshine, we should be celebrating the wonderful world that we live in. And yet, no matter where we are, there are some clouds on the horizon. There's wars and there's rumours of wars. There's little wars that have the potential to become major conflagrations. Practically every continent has its own problems, and some of them overlapping. There's wars over territory, there's wars over money, there's wars over religion, there's wars over race, there's potential disasters everywhere. The questions that we have to consider today is whether or not all these signs and symptoms are an actual forewarning of a major world strife on the scale of the two major wars that dominated the last century, or whether society will, through the use of logic, the use of intelligence, the use of interest and understanding, move away from that war, from the potential of war. But sadly, I don't see too many symptoms of it. And I think that there is a lot more blood yet to be spilled and guns yet to be fired. David is going to try and widen our understanding, and I trust he will make some predictions and analysis of what is likely to develop over the next period. So over to you, David.
Thanks, Jimmy, and greetings to all the comrades. First of all, I'm not going to make exact predictions, and I am not going to examine all the details. I hope that comrades will come in with many of those. What I am to do is to present a general framework and some key ideas for the way in which we analyze the sliding of the world into conflagration after conflagration, and to try and understand the phenomenon, and then to understand how in which the ways in which it could be resolved or deepened. The first point I think we need to make as Marxists is that wars arise out of the contradictions of the capitalist system. The general feeling among many people, and certainly among those that espouse realpolitik, is that war is an ancestral aspect of human nature. But Marxists argue that human nature, the species that we are, is one of a social and political animal looking to develop society, to develop our social relations, to be able to sustain our species through cooperation. And we do need to remember that if it weren't for the systematic development of cooperation, we wouldn't have advanced anywhere near we are today. But the truth is that the rise of property and patriarchy is the key to the understanding of war. For instance, indigenous people, the First Nation people in Africa and elsewhere, the San, who are sometimes called the Bushmen, are known as the gentle people, full of laughter, and with very low levels of conflict. The rise of property and the system of patriarchal capitalism, has accentuated the development of conflict of property relations. We just need to know that the operation of war, the development of war, clarifies relations between powers, but it's not in the open. You have to probe, you have to ask questions rather than just accept the obvious as we know. Now, that's the first point I want to make. The second is that US imperialism has been decisively weakened in the past period. And the EU and the European powers are unsettled or destabilized by economic and social developments, as well as certain technological lag in dealing with key crises. For instance, Germany, at the beginning of the Ukrainian war, was totally dependent on Russian oil, a fact which was key to their misunderstanding of the interests and a misunderstanding of the changes which were imminent. On the side of the United States, the hegemon no longer enjoys military supremacy. We've seen the rise of many middle-level powers which are prepared to challenge US supremacy, and even smaller guerrilla groups. We've seen that the US no longer fully controls logistics and sea lanes. The international finance and debt system is vulnerable. Sanctions do not work as they did in the past. There are ways around these. And for instance, we should just note that Russia is currently going through something of a boom, despite the fact that it's waging war and having to allocate increasing resources to the war in Ukraine. And in the global south, there's rage and contempt for the support by the United States of the oppression, the genocide in Gaza. And against this background of weakening is another sign that China is a rising military power, but it is careful not to rush into wars, and possibly has learned from the past U.S. Mistakes, and aware that it could suffer consequences. That's the second point. On the third point, I'm arguing, and it's not widely accepted, but and I'll come back to this question. But I'm arguing that we're entering into a prolonged period of near wider wars which start with an implosion and then tend to widen. The mobilization of every military, technological, economic, and strategic resource against opposing blocs, and the total mobilization with new blocks developing, which are developing a supply system of military equipment and material. At the moment, we see this developing around 2 points of wider conflagration, that is Gaza and Iran, and then, of course, that of Ukraine. But we mustn't forget that during the recent period, and particularly after the end of the COVID epidemic, we've seen further development of war, internal wars in the DRC, which has basically had one level of war or other from about 1960, most terrible, decline in society and vast destruction. In Sudan, a civil war which has got no ending. In Yemen, a war continuing. In Myanmar, Burma, we see war. Despite the fact that there's been a breakdown in these, let's say, the bipolar dominance, of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, we see that, in a way, this is new blocks are rising. For instance, new blocks are rising around Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And China has given enormous support to Russia to be able to nullify, to be able to neutralize the exercise of sanctions. I won't go more into that now, except to explain that North Korea has been brought into the fold. At times, there's an argument that morale operates independently of material conditions. But I do think what is happening in the past to Russia, when it found that it was short of material and turned to North Korea, enabled a counteroffensive. And as we know in the headlines today or yesterday, the United States has delayed in sending its arms. So there's, in a sense, the material questions, the equipment, the economic power of different blocks is the key to the military-industrial base, which is developing on a polarized basis, able to supply proxies in various areas, able to develop and widen conflict to an extent we haven't seen before. At the same time, well, let me go into some of the details, and it's mainly in relation to China. The EU has utterly failed in developing its own solar panels and moving into a green economy. Something like 85% of solar panels are provided, sold and bought in the EU come from China. China is now investing in a major way in Mexico to be able to access United States markets. And, this is seen, and Yellen was recently in China, seeing that the whole idea of Biden economics, that the manufacturing base in America could be redeveloped around green technologies, is somewhat in doubt, certainly threatened by the prospect of electrical vehicles being manufactured in Mexico, exported as Mexican products to United States. We've seen, the enormous range of diplomacy of China in the Pacific region, with blocks, well, small countries and islands which were previously completely under the direction of United States policy, now wavering and wondering whether they shouldn't accept, the terms which China's offered. So there's a certain rebalancing. It may be one way of looking at it, a challenge to United States dominance throughout the world. At the same time, as is quite evident in the last couple of weeks, great powers are trying to avoid the widening conflagrations. And if we look at the disastrous situation, the abyss which is opening up in Gaza, we've seen that Israel has been continuing its war against Hamas and against the Palestinian people. But with the intervention of Iran, there's been every attempt by countries in the region and by the United States is to try and hold back from an open conflagration. At the same time, war itself is as I'd argue, deeply irrational. With the development of conflict, you get kind of war psychosis developing. There's not the rational exposure and opening of exposure of interests and bargaining around interests as in a collective bargaining trade union situation. As someone put it, the guardrails, the rails against slipping into open and widening warfare are being lowered or disappearing. The existing guardrails of communication, diplomacy are evident, and in the past period we've seen with the waging of a kind of missile and drone attacks between Iran and Israel, brought them right to the brink of open warfare. At the same time, on both sides, it seems that there are attempts to be able to tone that down and to be able to say that, one losing an eye is the same as losing another eye, and not that you've lost both eyes and that you are now blinded and in rage. What's limiting limiting the prospects of war in terms of a real politic is the fear of one side of losing and of being annihilated, and also the question of some checks and balances, although those, as I've mentioned, are weakening. As we know, war depends on surprise up to the point of the invasion of Ukraine. Putin was insisting this was just a war maneuver. It was nothing like an open warfare. The surprise, I think, was quite complete. And then you had something of a surprise that the Ukrainian state didn't completely dissolve, and that Putin didn't actually immediately gain the ascendancy in Ukraine. So there are miscalculations, there's surprise, there's denial of basic facts, and so forth. And deterrence, as I've mentioned, is one factor holding back open conflagration. Israel insists that it should have an unbalanced deterrence. In other words, it should be, if it's one eye, then it should be an eye and a leg in response, and that the coercive threat, the widening and the deepening threat of force is the only way to maintain deterrence. Now, these are the calculations of, I wouldn't say political scientists, of the military strategists. And any one of those calculations could be completely wrong. And we could see open conflagrations, unbalanced responses. We're in a period of experimental exploring the ground. There's no rational. There are unknowns out there. Nobody really knows what's happening. All we do know is that we are moving closer and closer to developing military alliances which are linked to each other. So Iran is part of a bloc now with Russia and China. At the same time, there's ambiguity. It may stand back if things go further. All we can say is that the issue of war has become utterly dominant in power relations. And at the moment, I can't see any interest, for instance, in global warming. In India, the elections are going ahead now in conditions of devastating heat. No one expected this in Mali. There's a heat wave which has forced people on the street sellers to retreat. We're going into a period of unpredicted change in the environment in which we're living in. So that's all of a analysis of what there's currently. But there's also another factor, which is the sixth point I want to raise: the rise of anti-war movements, largely, and Roger's mentioned this, and we've discussed this in previous discussions. In Europe and in America, it's becoming quite a bitter contestation at the universities. Although we do not see these war movements in the South really to any extent, or obviously in despotic regimes where people have to put their life on the line in acting against the war machine. But as we know, there is this possibility, and I will come back and after discussion on the idea of, or not the idea, but the possible strategies for mobilizing campaigns on against war, for peace, and whatever prospects there might be of limiting wars, if not of peace. Just a final points in preparing for this discussion. I was reading around the question of Trump being in power, he heard at one time, it doesn't give the exact date, of the possible launch of a missile in Iran. He didn't like the idea that Iran should engage in missile tests, and he wanted to, to blow up the missile site and so forth. And then he was reminded that this was an act of war and that he needed to get authorization from Congress. He says they would never go along with it. And one of his officials then said, I know, but that's the system. In other words, there are some forms of checks and balances. On the other side, it's absolutely horrific. Any time there could be the most horrific miscalculation. We see unhinged people in power. And even those close to Trump are saying it is frightening beyond belief. And we didn't know what was going to happen from one minute to the other. So we do see a very delicate balance at the moment. It's not even a balance. I don't think we could use that term. It's an unbalanced system. Whether it can be further unbalanced and draw in all the regional and international powers in and around the struggle taking place in Gaza and between Iran and Israel, and where there could be prospects for a widening conflict in Iran. All these are immediate possibilities, and we've got to look at these in the face. As I've suggested, we're entering in a period of near wars in the sense of becoming ever widening conflicts. Every conflict has built a kind of set of alliances. At the same time, a war continues as before in the former colonial world with hardly an interest and hardly appearing in the international press. So the question then is, how do we understand the current lurching into a conflagrations? I'm using that term because at the moment that's what it is, rather than open widening warfare just yet, but preparations for that. How do we understand the possibility of miscalculations and the trigger of being pulled, for ever widening wars? And what response can we make to the prospect of these widening wars in developing an anti-war demonstrations and pressure? And how do we develop the working class movement to fill the gap which is opened up with these various wars, but mainly with the decline of U.S. imperialism? Is this going to be filled by new middle powers and greater powers, or can the working class mobilize and come to power and resolve the question of war and introduce a period of unparalleled peace? Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, David. A fairly comprehensive list of questions and comments there. I'm going to open it to the meeting to the comrades, and if possible, if you can use the hand signal. But given that we're on a full screen, if anybody wants to just hold up their own hand physically, I recognize it. Matthew, you're going to be the first one away.
Okay, thanks, comrades. Yeah, thanks to David anyway for his introduction. It's very useful, particularly obviously at the moment. I think there's a few things. I mean, first of all, obviously, is the military failure of the imperialists. With the failure of the offensive last year in Ukraine, essentially has destroyed the ability of the Ukrainian army, as has been pointed out by numerous people. In fact, of course, Ukraine has lost. And the question is, okay, what is the response of the NATO powers to the fact they have, they've lost, that they've actually managed to fight to effectively the last Ukrainian, which is, of course, obviously very dangerous. Because the question is, okay, what are they, Macron and so on and so forth saying, well, yeah, we will put in troops and all this sort of thing. Obviously, as a prelude to effectively nuclear exchange, with the obvious logical conclusion. So, that also, the other thing about Ukraine, of course, is it moves military strategy, because obviously the advent of drones and precision strikes means that your actual tactics and strategy become very different. You can't concentrate forces to the same degree. Everything moves in small bits, because otherwise, if you concentrate, you just get smashed. So things are changing enormously in military terms. Secondly, of course, the IDF in Gaza has militarily failed itself. I mean, it's failed to eliminate the Palestinian resistance of Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, the PFLP, because they're still around. They're still going around killing IDF members and smashing IDF armor. You can go and watch videos of this on YouTube in great length if you want. At the same time, also, of course, they failed to suppress the Houthis. The Houthis in Yemen managed to virtually interdict one of the key world's shipping lanes, the Red Sea. I think container traffic is down by more than 60% through that channel. Enormous impact on world trade, costs, particularly obviously countries like Egypt, which of course have now lost much of the revenue from the Suez Canal. So we can see all these things, in military terms, all these things happening. The key really then becomes, obviously, in order to go to war, the imperialists require to repress democratic rights. Is essentially what they're doing. We can see this across obviously we see this across all of the European countries, and particularly obviously Germany, where wearing a keffiyeh in Berlin will get you thrown in the back of a police car, where a conference, a Palestine conference in Berlin was shut down by 2,500 police last week, and people were basically then thrown out of Germany, were told they couldn't go to Germany. Yanis Varoufakis, Ghassan Abu Sitta, who's now the rector of Tusk University, he arrived in Germany, was then thrown back on a plane to London, told he was not welcome in Germany. So you can see that. You can also see this happening in the US, of course, where people are being removed from their jobs. There's repression of free speech on campuses, the use of police, sackings, mass arrests and all this sort of thing. A clear effort to remove the ability to speak and organise freely. You can see it here. I mean, you can see, in Britain, the notion that, but obviously, with all of these countries, there's a majority against the whole Gaza genocide, which is not an opinion which is completely not shared by any of the imperialist politicians. So you find this brutal split between the population and their so-called political representatives. The answer to that, of course, is repression. Here, of course, you have millions of people marching on the streets, particularly obviously in London, which are then labelled hate marches by virtually the entirety of Parliament. Subscribes to the notion that these are hate marches, and of course the lie that all of this is brought about by some kind of epidemic of anti-Semitism. Which is bizarrity, again, a completely bizarre notion, but one which is used for political repression. And so this is really the thing. The two go together. So you're faced with this thing. I think it's both again to say, okay, we're against war, and we're against the preparation for war, because obviously the other thing they're intending to do is to move towards far higher military expenditure, move towards far higher war production. I mean, we've seen, obviously Ukraine shows that the imperialists are incapable of actually fighting these major prolonged wars. They don't even make enough shells. They have to convert all this stuff to actually build huge numbers of new factories to modify the whole nature of production and so on in order to run these sort of operations. And in doing that, of course, obviously they also require the cooperation of the population, which is not clear they're going to get. So it's so to say, all of this goes together. The building of an anti-war movement, the defence of democratic rights, and at the same time also, the resistance towards production for war and death. We should be saying, in contrast to organisations like the Union in Britain, that we are not in favour of military production for these things. That we're not going to sit and watch. Workers should not take part in producing for this form of mass killing. Okay, thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Any other comrades signalling just yet? John? Yeah, fire away, John. You're muted. Dominic, your microphone's off.
There, John.
Oh,
Yeah,
there
can you hear me now?
Yes, clear now.
I think the period we're in now is a period, as I see, of massive contradictions. For instance, you have Joe Biden, who's been led by the nose by Netanyahu, calling for restraint, and at the same time, last night in the US Congress, I forget the amount, I think it was £10 billion, 16 billion pounds worth of armaments was voted through to Israel. Israel, from what I can gather, has a very viable arms industry. In fact, it exports arms. And the situation is one that Israel is acting like a cross between a bull in a china shop and a totally spoilt child who wants to kick things around. For instance, we have the situation internationally where we're all supposed to sing from the same hymn sheet. We're all supposed to support unconditionally the Ukraine. We're all supposed to support unconditionally Israel. And at the same time, where there are, if you like, in Ukraine's case, quite serious corruption going on, the Ukraine is desperate for armed men, for people to join the army. At the same time, it allowed a mass migration from Ukraine to Western Europe, where I don't know how many hundreds of thousands of men of fighting age are based and do not seem to be in any hurry to get back to the Ukraine, because in my opinion, one of the features of the Ukrainian war from both Russia and the Ukraine is a complete disregard for the lives of its own soldiers. They seem to be quite happy to have huge casualties. And, that to my money, is a serious criticism of that war. But going to the situation in Gaza, Israel, we're all supposed to support Israel when Israel breaks every rule in the book by bombing the consulate of Iran in Syria. There's all sorts of diplomatic protocols. For instance, this week, there was a move to try and prosecute a Libyan for the death of Yvonne Fletcher, who was a policewoman shot 40 years ago by somebody in the Libyan embassy in London. But because they had diplomatic immunity, there's nothing the British government could do about this blatant murder of a police officer. And yet Israel thinks, right, it's fair game to go and bomb a consulate in Syria and kill whoever is in that consulate. And the whole of the West is supposed to sing in harmony. Yes, that's okay. And yet, if Iran does anything in terms of proxies, that's all wrong. Now, today I was listening to a guy on Al Jazeera who is from Columbia University, and he was pro Palestinian and anti-Israel, but he was scathing about Biden, because the one thing most Americans do not want is a weak president. And whether, whatever thoughts one might have on Biden, the one thing you can say is an absolutely weak, words fail me to say just how weak he is. He's been led by the nose by Netanyahu. Netanyahu tells him to stop his genocidal war in Gaza, and he gets a two-fingered salute. Well, Biden tells Netanyahu, and Netanyahu gives him a two-fingered salute and says, look, we want more arms. And Biden, oh yes, how many do you want? Not what are you going to use them for? And Biden gives in on that. Now, this professor that was speaking today said something. I don't know if it's true or it's not true, but we'll give it the benefit of the doubt. He said that Israel is seriously worried about Iran because in all that chaff of drones, 3,000 or 300 drones and missiles that came over a few days ago into Israel, he said there were one or two hypersonic rockets. And he said Israel is seriously concerned that if Iran has hypersonic rockets, then they could do untold damage in Israel. Now, we know from about 2 years ago that the Russians declared that they had developed a hypersonic rocket. Now, if they've transferred that to Iran in exchange perhaps for the drones that Iran is supplying to Israel, to Russia, then forgive me, I'm a bit confused here. Then, one could see the situation where Israel might enter into a war where it wasn't going to have all its own way. All the wars in the last 40, 50 years between Israel and its Arab neighbours have all been a one-sided affair where Israel has wiped the floor with them. And as this professor said, up till the 7th of October, one thought that if there was a war in the Middle East, then Israel would wipe the floor with whoever opposed it. And we're seeing in southern Lebanon, not all the time, but every now and again, Hezbollah will fire a rocket that will be accurate and hit a military base. So they do have weapons that can be serious in wars. But as far as Netanyahu and his government are concerned, they're looking to the United States, actually, in my opinion, to be a partner in the war against Iran. And quite frankly, I think, as has been said, in America, people are sick and tired of the barbarity of the conflict in Gaza in particular, but also in the West Bank, of the Israelis. They've no regard for human life. They are hell-bent on their dream of, from the river to the sea, of an Israeli state. In fact, Netanyahu, prior to the recent events, presented a map at the United Nations, basically showing that Palestine did not exist, that Israel existed. It was a one-state apartheid system. I'll leave it at that, comrades. I'm sorry for mixing up Iran, Israel, and Russia and naming them wrongly.
I didn't notice, John. Any other comrade wish to come in at the moment? One of the things that question that we haven't really touched on much is the role of the labour movement internationally, whether or not it can change the perspectives through a mobilisation of union members. In case of Gaza, there have been a lot of demonstrations internationally, and here in Ireland there have been regular weekly demonstrations, sometimes well over 1,000 in the cities. But one interesting thing this week that has a good significance is that the main postal sorting office in Dublin has taken, the workers in there have passed a resolution of refusing to handle Israeli post, and have put a demand onto the union executive nationally to support it. Now, the interesting thing about it is that the national executive representative made some comments about it, justified the position of the workers, and in a backhanded way supported them, but also signalled that there was questions of illegalities in what they're proposing, and there was also an international convention that if post was posted, post would be delivered, and they had a responsibility for that. And the out that he has looked at now is he wants to have a discussion with the management of the postal service and representatives of the government, etc. So, but nevertheless, it's important that although the leader representing the executive of the union may feel uncomfortable, he did not in any way criticise or disown his members. And that's an important point in this situation. So it would be important that that be broadcast widely as well, in the hope that others will follow. I go back to yourselves, comrades. Anybody particularly want to come in with a contribution at this stage? Roger?
Well, just a few observations, comrade. I thought David gave a very, very good, clear introduction. It's very the general principle of the capitalism. Capitalism, by its very nature, entails war and means war. The actual prediction of how and when and by what process the war starts is a little more difficult to calculate, because I think the first thing, obviously, we see tensions, huge tensions and contradictions building up. We have in the world today, as David has shown, there's obviously there's the conflict of Russia and NATO, as shown most graphically in the Ukraine war. There's the conflict between Israel and Iran, with, of course, the USA behind Israel. We have also building up over a longer term the tension between USA and China in relation to Taiwan, and of course a whole host of other issues too. And as David said, countless regional conflicts, wars, civil wars, and tensions. And I think, we talked before about the so-called Thucydides thesis, that one empire will always, as one empire declines, it becomes into conflict with rising empires and the inevitability of a conflict. And that's generally true. And most wars are, under capitalism, are explained by that. Empires crumble, rivals manifest themselves and clash with the old rivals. But we've seen when we think in the past of the collapse of old empires, we have seen empires that have just disappeared, if you like. The Ottoman Empire, the Habsburg Empire, the Romanovs and the Hohenzollerns and so on, which more or less, of course, in the First World War, they were all the casualties, but they came also because of revolutions from subject peoples, particularly, the Ottoman Empire crumbled because of the Arab revolt, and obviously the Romanovs with the Russian Revolution and so on. That they were not simply a question of not only a question of clashes with external enemies, but the contradictions, the internal contradictions and revolutionary tensions building up within their borders. What about the USA and Britain? That seems to be an exception. That the British Empire ruled the world in the 19th century and into the 20th century, and the USA apparently seamlessly took over its role. But of course, what the USA did was in 2 world wars, they held back. They allowed the declining power of the British Empire to be sapped by wars and world wars with Germany, and in both cases they stepped in at a late stage in order to once the powers of the British Empire had been sufficiently weakened, and they simply took over the role, and Britain became a kind of very junior partner in alliance with the USA. They only stepped in to claim the fruits of victory, if you like, right at the end of the First World War, and only, you could say, halfway through the Second World War. We see now, though, I mean, the declining power of US too. They failed after 20 years. They failed their intervention in Afghanistan. They failed their intervention in Syria, in the Syrian civil war. They failed in the long run in Iraq. And in fact, Iran became the main victor in the conflict there. And we see in the same way now, US is facing this new threat of conflagration in a severely weakened and declining position. At the same time, Russia also has declined, but the China and the satellites and the some of its allies in the BRIC alliance and so on are gaining power and gaining the initiative. But how and when will a conflict arise? I think we have to say, during the period of the Cold War, there was always talk of war by accident. And of course, that was ridiculous. You don't have just wars by accident. But at the same time, the timing and the occasion and the process by which wars break out can come accidentally. And what we're seeing now, we can say in general, there's a build-up of tensions between the American empire and the rising Chinese empire, I think we can call it that, with all their allies and associates at the same time. But the timing and the way, it can come from miscalculations. There was the famous quote, which we've used before, by George Shultz, a former Secretary of State in the USA, that negotiations, I can't remember the exact words he used, but in effect, it was negotiations are meaningless unless you have the shadow of power over the negotiating table. In other words, negotiations are simply another form of threats and counter-threats. And we see that, in fact, there can be wars which are not the general motivations and reasons for the wars, of course, are something that can be calculated and explained and interpreted by Marxists. But the actual occasion by which the war can be sparked off can come can be accidental, or can come as a surprise. The Cuban Missile Crisis, for instance, came because there was bluff and counter bluff, threat and counter threat, miscalculations, and all the rest of it. But it could have developed into war, or at least it could have developed into a physical armed military confrontation, which then perhaps both sides might have stepped back for a time. But the implicit in the whole situation is contradictions and new threats, and any spark could be enough to set off the conflagration. And I think that's what we're seeing today. Russia, for instance, didn't expect. I think this is right to say Russia didn't expect that it would be involved in a war lasting several years in order to dominate Ukraine. I think they thought, after all, there was no response when they took over Crimea. There was their intervention in the Donbass. There was no there was a civil war within the eastern Ukraine, but it didn't reach the level of conflict between major powers. And they thought, I think, that they could walk into Ukraine and at least take over without sparking off a war in which NATO would get involved, a proxy war by NATO, they have found themselves landed with the war. And the same thing, similar situation can develop in all of these countries. And of course, the latest example of that is Israel and Iran. It's unclear now whether or not the immediate threat of a full-scale war between them can be ruled out. Probably it looks like both sides have contented themselves with a show of strength and a warning, and will probably step back for a time. But it's very difficult to say. One of the factors being the instability and lawlessness, if you like, of Netanyahu, who's desperate for the war to continue, because he knows that as soon as the war, the threat of war recedes, then he's going to be out of power and in jail. And you would have thought that a more robust, I agree with what John said about the weakness of Biden, that a more robust American leadership might have been able to impose some kind of restraints on Israel in conditions that they would perhaps impede the export of arms to them, perhaps put further pressure on Israel, and perhaps at the same time somehow arrange immunity from prosecution for Netanyahu, and on the basis that power would pass to more reliable or less volatile Israeli leadership. But I don't know. All of this is speculation. All we can say really is that we're moving towards a more and more dangerous, more and more explosive situation, which, irrespective of the day-to-day agendas of this or that leader on either side, that could easily propel the conflict, could easily be propelled over the boundary towards full-scale war. So anyway, there's a few thoughts. I don't know if that helps.
Okay, thanks, Roger. I see Dominic's hand up, and as he hasn't spoken before, I let him go. And Matthew, I think you want to go behind him. Okay, Dominic.
Okay, thanks, Jim. I just the thing that sort of seriously worries me, particularly as far as the situation in Europe seems to be concerned, is the total absence of the organised labour movement in any form of intervention or any sort of statement about this. I mean, you've got the Social Democrats in Britain under Starmer's leadership, totally pro-Israel. They can get away with what they like, and totally pro anything America does as far as China's concerned, Iran's concerned, or anywhere else in the world's concerned. And you've got the sort of situation in Germany, which is, operating genocide. It's got that in its history in the past. Is now sort of can't do anything about Israel because they've got a clause apparently in the constitution about supporting Israel because of that. So basically, their constitution says they can support genocide because it's Israel that's doing it. Absolute madness for anybody to do it. It's like Jimmy was saying about the post office. The workers want to do something about the situation in Israel and Gaza and take some action on it. And the leadership step in and start using the old crap about it's the law and all the rest of it. Well, if it was the law that ruled things, the labour movement wouldn't exist in the first place. So, I mean, these points have got to be made. And the thing is, I see no sort of break on the capitalists coming from the working class because of the leadership. And that could be a break against, you know, if you like, sparks setting things off. Because in the Middle East, as far as Israel's concerned, its history is that it can go about bombing and killing freely as it likes, and nobody can do anything about it. And now Iran is saying they're fed up with that. And they're really wary about getting into a war with Israel. But how much can you take? Their position at home is what you call that they've got the support of the people. And it wouldn't be the first time in history that some leadership that's on the brink of collapse has turned to war as a means of supporting itself and rallying the nation behind, you know, we're at war, we've got to defend ourselves. I mean, we saw that in the Falklands. And that sort of thing is, I don't know how you measure it. I don't know how you can calculate whether that's going to happen or not. But I think these are things that are, you know, in my mind, is a total absence of any actions by the labour and trade union movement. And just as an aside to what Roger was saying about Netanyahu, I believe there are moves in the courts in Israel to declare him insane or his mental health problems and try and get rid of him that way. So you don't know what the melt is, but if you like, the field is empty as far as the labour movement's concerned of having any actions in this struggle that's taking place. And I think that's something that's very serious.
Okay, Dominic. Thanks, Dominic. Matthew, you wanted to come back in again, and I would ask if any other comrade wants to come in. I'd welcome it. Other than that, after Matthew, I'll go back to David for a while.
Right, thanks, guys. Yeah, the thing is, I think it's quite clear that the US imperialists decided on the policy of war after the fall of the Soviet Union. You know, they actually moved towards that, and they've carried it out. And the thing is, obviously, you know, you can look back on the history of US imperialism and so on. But I mean, they actually said, well, we now, after the fall of the Soviet Union, said, well, we now run the world. You know, we don't have a problem, don't have the problems we had previously, and therefore we'll be around to impose what we want on it by means of war. So hence you get this vast increase, you know, the big increase in military spending, and a move towards, you know, aggressive wars in numerous sections of the world. The thing is that also, of course, they understand the US ruling class is not stupid. It understands it's in a precarious position. I mean, you know, the reason they hate the Chinese, of course, is the Chinese became the world's largest manufacturer in about 2012. They know that, you know, in those terms, they're on notice, you know, and they ain't going to go quietly. That's the point. I mean, you know, they intend to try and substitute, you know, military force for the decline of their economic power. You know, and it's quite conscious. The thing is that also in terms of Israel, I mean, you know, the thing is, the problem for the Americans, of course, is they, from 1967, they decided to back the Israelis in the Middle East as a means of controlling the Middle East. So therefore, you know, it's their dog and they're stuck with it. And I don't think it's particularly a weakness of Biden. It's a problem that they can't do anything else. You know, Israeli, as we know, I mean, the state of Israel is extremely fragile. You know, actually, of course, you've had this thing with the you know, vast movement against Netanyahu and so forth until you know, just before the war. and that clearly the whole thing is in a very fragile state. Now, if the US says, okay, we'll move to get rid of Biden, I mean, what happens next? You know, they can't be assured of what forces come to power after that, or indeed if the thing holds together. So, I mean, they're actually sort of trying to say, okay, well, you know, we'll just have to stick with what we've got. And plus, of course, I mean, obviously Biden and co are you know, crazed Zionists. And this is, I mean, this is the same for the entire. I mean, it becomes really quite clear because obviously you've got this, you know, the imperialist politicians, and it's almost a hallmark, are Zionists completely, you know. Whereas obviously within the population, you're seeing this, you know, people have been steadily turning away from that whole support for that whole business. I mean, most starkly, of course, in the American Jewish population, where all youth generally are anti-Zionists and have been leading the anti-war movement. You know, from a country that originally, of course, and still, actually, of course, the civilian Zionist billionaires and so on and so forth have been providing enormous support to Israel, but the actual population not. And we can see it, you know, obviously we see it in Britain, in which, you know, over 2/3 of the population is against this war, and the whole thing, you know, is turning against the notion of Israel. So, I mean, in those terms, it's a process, it's a shift process, but it's a process that poses this enormous problem for American imperialism. You know, how does it deal with it? So, I mean, it may not like. I mean, it clearly has differences between the Americans and Netanyahu and so on and so forth, but they can't really. They don't really have an alternative that they can immediately put in place. So they just having back what they've got. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Matthew. Lauren, there's a hand signal up in front of you. Do you wish to come in? Say that you have a hand signal on your screen. Do you wish to come in? No, sorry, I misled here. It's actually the signal from my own mouse. I apologize. But having said that, if you do wish to come in, I would welcome it. No.
Jimmy, could I come in?
Okay, David.
A bit, and then I just want to change gear a little, and respond to some points. I just want to put up some data which you know is a little extraordinary and not well accepted, but you know, there are some important facts here which help us understand the period from which we've emerged and the period which we are entering. It's hard to believe that some economic and military theorists argue that the period which we're in is a period of, I wouldn't say peace, but of low intensity conflict. But we need to see from the background, or have a look at the background from which we're emerging. In other words, if we look at this, the red line, which is, I think, the fatalities of war, we could see that you know, the peak rose in World War II, after the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish Revolution. Then it was followed by the Vietnam War, the war in Vietnam, and many colonial conflagrations, genocide in Cambodia, Afghan Civil War, genocide in Rwanda, and so forth. But the numbers and the gross figures of fatalities, the numbers are declining. And so for some, this is a period in which there is the most extreme tension currently, but it's not indicating that there will be a rising conflagration. And I suppose the characteristic we could draw from this is that after the Second World War, there was an attempt, at least in Europe and the United States, among the great powers, to limit wars and, in fact, to almost completely to eliminate wars in Europe. And from the period of in the perspective of US imperialism, to concentrate on wars which would safeguard their interests, particularly in the former colonial world. And then you had oddities like, well, I wouldn't say oddities is the right word, but you do have unusual phenomena like the genocide in Rwanda, which was completely ignored internationally in the early 1990s, but led to the deaths of estimated 1 million or more. So I just wanted to put that up to try and get some sense of where we are. In my view, if you look to the lower right, you can see that the intensity of conflicts and the fatalities was rising. And I think that's the period in which we're in. Now, some response to the points which, by the way, which are very valuable. We have had a period of in which we're emerging, which even I think Obama mentioned it as forever wars which have no end. Those are the wars of imperialism, and actually have continued with in some ways weakening, well, more in some ways, actually weakening US imperialism and causing a real devastation internally. I don't think comrades really have a good understanding of the development of, say, for instance, the distribution of and consumption of drugs in America. The Vietnam War changed all that immensely. When I walk around the area and I hear of different places and so forth, and in the small town I'm in, people say this is where the drug dealing started. This is where the vets came back. One was completely out of his mind. I mean, we have no understanding of the human destruction, not just of those that die in a war, but actually of the ripping apart of the fabric of society, which wasn't maybe marvelous, but at least it wasn't declining to such an extent. So there's that. Then the wars have continued. We've seen Afghanistan has hardly been without a war for the past 50 years or so. Now, the broad considerations I think we've got to have in mind is that all this talk of a pre-war situation, which we highlighted in the notice of this meeting and elsewhere, is that there is increasing expenditure on war. We're developing war economies, as happened in the 1950s and 60s, and it's all unproductive investment. In other words, this is a huge cost on capitalism. The war itself, the operation of war, is incredibly expensive. For instance, although there was a stupid celebration that the Iron Dome against missiles and drones was effective in Israel, this is enormously expensive. I think that some of these missiles which are used in the Iron Dome come in at a price of $1 million a piece. This is fantastic. And now it's going against a small drone, which maybe costs something like $20,000. So the costs of war are fantastic. And, you know, the development of cheaper rockets, which is what is happening in North Korea and in other countries, missiles which can, you know, go considerable distances. You know, all of this makes war, the actual conduct of war, quite unpredictable and increasingly expensive. Now, Matthew raised a number of useful points, and I do think we need to look at what's happening in relation to Iran from the perspective of other Arab states, it is extraordinary that we've had such a well, I wouldn't say a conflagration yet, but such a warfare, such the mobilization against the Palestinian people without a huge rise in oil prices. In the past, it was inevitable. Every Middle East war led to enormous costs in terms of rising prices of oil. Of course, oil has risen in price, and it's been an extraordinary advantage to Russia, and that is one of the reasons it's managed to have economic growth at this time. But the point in relation to into Iran is that many other, obviously Saudi Arabia, although there's a patched up relationship, there is no willingness for Iran to gain in prestige from the conflict which is currently taking place. As I think we all know, Egypt doesn't provide solace for the people of Gaza because it's imprisoning or even assassinating people who support Hamas in Egypt. So there are all these factors which are hidden, but actually, as we look at the progress of the war, we need to take into account. But just one point in the general economic or general military political situation, we see the rise of middle-level powers who actually have their own interests at play. In the DRC, for instance, I don't know exactly how South Africa calculates its interests, but it's behind the current government and moving increasingly against Rwanda. In Middle East, Turkey actually has its own interests, quite how that all works out. But these can become major factors as the not only in terms of the play of military play and that of diplomacy, but also of technological change. For instance, in the Russian invasion and war in Afghanistan was really, I won't say it brought to a halt, but it was certainly incredibly damaged by the American provision of Sting missiles, to the guerrilla forces, which eventually, took power. So technological developments, as Matthew has explained, are really important, and everything is changing and changing more rapidly as we see it. We've seen the enormous decline of U.S. imperialism. Again, it's a point where the military cannot make up the economic decline. And we see with the visit of Yellen to China recently, I won't say panic, but alarm at the advance of Chinese manufacturing. One of the figures I should mention is that China now produces 31% of all manufacturing output is Chinese at the moment. So I don't think any nation, well, maybe at certain points, the United States had that figure, but it's a rising power, not a declining power. And that constrains the development of manufacturing in the United States. Cheap prices are, what even the American supporters of Trump or Biden want, cheaper cars and so forth. And we see a decided advantage to the Chinese bureaucracy at this point. Roger mentions the cut and thrust of bluff, counter bluff, and the way in which this can work out in a series of miscalculations. I do think that war is essentially an irrational process. Everyone talks about the goals of war, but what are the goals of say Russia in relation to Ukraine? they're never explicitly made, except to say they are being achieved on or in one way or the other. But is it to to completely occupy Ukraine? What is the goal of Netanyahu in relation to Gaza? A little more clearer, but it's so horrific that he could hardly put words to it without being condemned in international courts and elsewhere. But it's an essentially the elimination of the civilian population, which could provide some basis of support, for Hamas. So we see a very unpredictable, a very difficult situation, but one in which the labor movement is silent. But we do need to see where, there has been a movement. I was surprised because I'm a little bit in touch with one of the officials in the International Transport Federation, ITF. But in the recent conference they had in West Africa, they came out with a resolution demanding a ceasefire in Gaza, and that they would campaign against the support for Israel in various countries. Now, no doubt that was brought about because it was taking place in Africa, but we should see and work with every advance that is made in the labor movement, against war, and develop our ideas about developing greater support and for a ceasefire and for a complete transformation in the war situations that we're looking at. I'll stop there.
Okay, David. There was just one thing, David, while you were speaking there and you put up your chart, there was one part of it which irritated me. And I'm not going to blame you because it's a universal blame. And that is when people talk about the Holocaust, even on your chart, it was defined as Jewish Holocaust. And while I'm not going to deny the Jewish Holocaust took place, it did, and it was criminal. But the vast majority of people on this planet forget the trade unionists, the socialists, the homosexuals, the Roma, the disabled, and all the others who were destroyed in the camps. And many of them, particularly those with labor and socialist backgrounds, who preceded the pogroms against the Jews. It's something that it just needles me that the working class, and which essentially was the reason for the war, the destruction of the working class internationally. It's been written out of history. I would ask any other comrade if they wish to come in again, or anybody want to put in new points into the discussion. No, everybody's shy and everybody's satisfied. David, if you wish to make any summary comments, I know you've done very well so far, but any brief points that you feel you might have missed on?
Well, yeah, thanks, Jimmy, and thanks for all the points that comrades have made. Just one, and I agree with you entirely on the question of the way in which genocide is described in relation to what happened in Germany during the war. We do need to constantly remind ourselves of the complete suppression and physical elimination of the of the labor movement leaders and Gypsies and other people, Romani people, and so forth. I think it's an excellent point. Just if I could conclude on this point, I mean, at one time, can you believe it? Immanuel Kant said that we could have peace, universal peace, if we had a democratic state and we would have all the checks and balances and so forth. He also added, I think, about 6 other points, that there wouldn't be a standing army. There would only be an army called up if there was an emergency. I was deeply skeptical about that. Now, maybe Kant is not the highest ranked philosopher in the world, but that's an interesting point. The point is, if you look at those, they're not completely irrelevant. Obviously, a standing army is an extreme danger to democracy and is a constant factor for war because it's ever present to go to war. That's a standing army which was ready to fight at any time. Gives an impulse for any political leadership to take action, which is going to result in war. But then we haven't seen, in a sense, we don't have democratic states in which ordinary working people have that control to be able to completely control that leadership, which, as you see with the examples that we gave in relation to Trump, and imagine also in relation to Biden, but we just don't know from Trump. Some of the people around him actually were prepared to say how he was at the point of war and so many times and had to be restrained. And that is in a democratic state. Well, let me say this, at a state in which the elections take place and some tradition of democracy. And we can see many of our leaders, I mean, the point was made in relation to Netanyahu, actually are beyond control. It's the possibility of slipping and not just miscalculations, deliberate actions taken, which lead on to unprecedented consequences are ever present. Again, in the small town I'm in, there's some swimming pools, and I noticed this, and people said, yes, those used to be bomb shelters. In other words, the idea at present was that once you'd survived the missile crisis or the crisis, around the development of missiles in Cuba in the early 1960s, people could actually turn towards the idea of peace. But how do we achieve peace? I think it's clear that even at the kind of ready-made points that Kant made in relation to no standing army, democratic states, I mean, obviously they had to be universal. And as we know, even any form of bourgeois democracy, and particularly under the conditions of imperialism, has even led their own leaders like Obama to say we're into forever wars, wars which go on without end or eventually end up with the US withdrawing. But then those wars continue in another way, as we see in Afghanistan. There's no peace after war. So we see those conditions. How do we get out of it? The argument, we have to mobilize. We have to look at every opportunity to come out against war and to be able to present a socialist vision of the world in which there could be peace and permanence. An unbelievable point at this moment. But we do need to have that in our minds. That is what we're fighting for. Thank you, comrades.
Thank you, David. Before I hand over to Roger, I just want to add an observation, again, based on something you said earlier, David, a very important point, that war is very expensive. And when you take that point and consider where does the money come from and where does it go, and when you relate that to the billions that were voted through the American legislature for spending in Taiwan, in Ukraine, and in Israel, it's going to be spent on bombs, it's going to be spent on technology, and an awful lot of that money is going to go back to the US private sector and international private sector. So it's really just a con job of taking workers' money through the state and turning it into profits for the international arms industry. So with that observation, I would hand over now to Roger for any news on next week?
Well, next week is the nearest Sunday to May Day, so it's been our tradition on the May Day to invite speakers and to have a general celebration. We don't have a lot to celebrate nowadays, but at least we have our traditions and we have our festival, and it's a time to review the condition of the working class internationally. I can't tell you any details yet of who'll be speaking because we're still trying to arrange that. I have to say one little problem we have. It's I don't think it will concern anybody here, but Pam is the comrade who is in charge of the lists, the mailing lists, and she's away for 2 or 3 weeks and out of contact. She assured me that she had sent me the updated mailing list, and I'm sure she did, but it was my fault that I didn't check it before she left. But as at present, I can't seem to find the new mailing list. I mean, I have the old one, which I used to use up until a few weeks ago, and therefore most people, there'll be very few people who are left off the notification. But I thought I ought to apologise for that there may be some comrades who will not receive the notice. But as I say, the vast majority, we do have a mailing list which is close to 400 people. Pity we don't get more of them attending our meetings, but at least they're aware of the YouTube recordings that are always there, and which I think I used quite a lot. So anyway, comrades, do come next week, and also do come with preparations of your own contributions about the meaning of May Day to you and to the working class in your countries. And if anybody volunteering to speak or or who has appropriate speakers that they'd like to invite, please do let us know. Okay. So see you next week, comrades.